This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, Will Carr investigates the postmodern delights of The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles, with writer and editor Charles Drazin. Telling the story of the meeting between the gentleman Charles Smithson and the disgraced Sarah Woodruff, The French Lieutenant's Woman defies the conventions of the Victorian novels to which it pays homage. Putatively a love story, the narrative leads to multiple conflicting endings. Of the novel, Anthony Burgess wrote, "A very modern mind is manipulating us as well as the characters." John Fowles was born in 1926 in Essex. After training to join the Navy, he studied at New College, Oxford, where he became interested in writing. After university, he became a teacher, holding posts in Britain, France and Greece, the latter inspiring the setting of his novel The Magus. His first novel, The Collector, was published in 1963. And he went on to write 6 more novels, a book of essays, a collection of poetry, and several more non-fiction works. He died in 2005. Charles Drazin is the editor of 2 volumes of journals by John Fowles. He's written about a variety of subjects. His books on film include In Search of the Third Man and The Faber Book of French Cinema. He's written the histories The Man Who Outshone the Sun King, which tells the story of Louis XIV's finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet, and Mapping the Past, which follows a family of Irish Catholic surveyors who mapped vast swathes of the British Empire. His most recent book, Making Hollywood Happen, tells the inside story of a little-known company that in the past 70 years has overseen the production of hundreds of the most celebrated movies ever made. He's currently working on the Faber Book of British Cinema. Find out more at charlesdrazin.com. For all the relevant links and a list of all the books mentioned, head to the description of the episode. Here's Will Carr, who spoke to Charles Drazin about The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles in April 2025.
So welcome, Charles. Thanks so much for taking part.
Thank you for having me.
I thought a good place to start is perhaps not so much with Anthony Burgess, but with you, really. Perhaps you could share with us something of how you first discovered John Fowles' work and indeed what you made of it. Maybe what your first impressions were of this particular novel, or indeed of him and his work generally.
My first contact with John Fowles would have been probably either just before I went to university, which was in the early 80s, or just after. At that time, so early 80s, he just was a huge writer on the literary landscape, phenomenally successful, but also had this huge literary reputation. And I think probably, well, I know the first novel I would have read of John's would have been The Collector. And that, I think, compared to his other work, is a comparatively conventional short novel, which has huge narrative drivers. It's a thriller, essentially. So I started with the easiest novel of his, and on I went. And it wasn't until many, many years later that I encountered John again, and that was in a completely different context. 10 years later, more than 10 years later, I was working in publishing as an editor. And after many years of working at Penguin Books first, and then leaving to become a freelance editor, I was asked if I would edit John's journals. So I'm trying to remember when I was asked to contribute to this podcast. I was trying to remember when did I first read The French Lieutenant's Woman? And I think I was asked if I would be interested in editing John's journals. And I did a crash course of reading John's novels, of which one was The French Lieutenant's Woman. My job was to edit the journals. And as part of that, obviously, I needed to read all the novels. So I wasn't focusing particularly on The French Lieutenant's Woman.
Well, what did you make of it, though? I mean, as part of that, getting to know the wider corpus of his work.
This is the other thing I find very fascinating, thinking back to that time, because I think the way I feel about The French Lieutenant's Woman now is so very different from the way I felt about it when I read it for the first time, because I think it has this tremendous narrative drive. John was a great storyteller, and I think that would be the first impact it had on me. It was a terrific romantic novel, and I think that's what I would have most appreciated. That's what would have most come through on the first reading. But then on successive readings, and I don't think there were too many successive readings, one or two, I would have felt very different about it, not only through just the very process of rereading something, going into something in greater depth than you possibly can on the first reading, but also, of course, through knowing John and getting to know his world, and then reinterpreting and thinking about the novel in terms of what I knew about John. So I feel that my particular reading of the novel is very determined by this very unusual personal experience I had of John's world.
You began there, though, by describing it as essentially as a terrific read, as a romantic novel with tremendous narrative drive, and I'd certainly agree with that assessment. I've come to this work relatively recently. I wonder if you could tell us a bit of the detail of it, though. I mean, what was the novel about, and what kind of thing could a reader come into it cold expect to find?
Well, I think it's on two levels, isn't it? So the most immediate level is the story of a Victorian aristocrat who is engaged to be married. And before that engagement can take place, he falls madly in love with another woman. So it's a kind of classic love triangle. That's on one level. But on a much deeper level, I think actually it's the story of something else. It's the story of an age, a world which provides a platform for our modern world, but is very, very far removed from it in the Victorian age. So I think it, on the one hand, a love story, and on the other, a kind of biography, a sociological, anthropological study of this extraordinary age, the attitudes, the values, its psychology, its feeling. One phrase I can remember John saying to me once, I can remember we were talking, well, what does a novel do? What is a novel? And he said, well, what a novel does, it's about feeling truths. That's what a novel does. It's about the truth, but it's a different kind of truth from conventional truth. It's about how we feel. I think what he was doing with The French Lieutenant's Woman was digging down into how an age felt. What was it like to be Victorian? What were their values? And I think that's what he's tried to do in the novel.
Absolutely. He's at pains, really, to give some authority, I guess, to his fiction writing by referring to some primary sources, by relating to other texts from the Victorian era. But at the same time, he's quite clear that what he's writing is a modern novel, I think, that he's writing a contemporary novel. What do you make of having those two things at the same time? It's a biography of an age. It makes the reader feel what it's like to be a Victorian, but at the same time, you don't really forget that it's a contemporary novel.
Well, I don't think that they're in contradiction. I think it's the quest for truth that makes it difficult for John to pretend that what he's writing is just fiction. He's writing about a past time, and to respect the conventions of the novel is to indulge in an exercise of make-believe that John feels in some way travesties the truth. So to pretend that he's not a 20th century writer and to leave out that voice is in some way to deny the truth. So I think it was very, very important for him in looking back to that time and writing a story about that time that he retain his modern values, because it's a time that's being perceived through modern eyes, his eyes. That accounts for if there's any kind of contradiction between the modern voice and the Victorian story.
Let's, if we can, talk a little bit about Anthony Burgess and what he had to say about the novel and John Fowles. He describes, as you do really, the novel as being highly readable and informative. He says it's compelling and thrilling and erotic. All of this is taken from his brief review of the novel in his 99 novel selection. But he also says in that short piece that we, the readers, are not permitted to relax as if we're reading Dickens or Thackeray. I was quite intrigued by that idea of being not allowed to relax when you're reading it. What do you make of that assessment? And perhaps more generally, what do you think a good approach is to take when you're reading what is quite a complicated book that you've outlined?
I guess what novelists do is create a finite world. You know, the craft involves, well, that word, make-believe. It creates a world in a series of fictional characters who then taken through a certain narrative line, and an ending is produced at the end. And I think in some way that travesties reality and in some way accounts for the structure of the French lieutenant's woman. I mean, it's a kind of almost, I mean, it's a very strange novel. The more you think about it, it's such a strange novel because it feels as much at times like a sociological study or a history book as it does a novel. And John, because I think he's tried to, the motivation is try to dig to some kind of truth, while at the same time being aware that you can never actually get to a final truth. That accounts for this refusal ever to settle for a neat pattern.
Yes, it is a sometimes unbalancing experience, really, reading the book, because as you say, it has these historical qualities, has kind of social commentary kind of qualities, and it has quite a lot of information in it, really, about, you know, the geography of Lyme Regis or what went on in Exeter in 1867. It's like a detailed study of Victorian life, but at the same time, the interactions between characters, obviously the nature of the love triangle that sets up the narrative, all of that is obviously quite fictional, but it does draw you in, I suppose, to a world very effectively, while never quite letting you forget that it's a world that's quite distant, and indeed one that perhaps he's created himself.
Well, I think it's he's trying to understand that world, but it's a world that he's always examining in contrast to his world. So it throws into relief the modern age he inhabits, looking back at this world where things happened in a very different way and people felt about things in a very different way.
I suppose one of the most obvious ways in which it's perhaps discombobulating is the novel doesn't conform to our expectations around its endings, in that it's got three of them, and it's almost as if the narrator of the novel offers the reader some choices about how the story ends according to their preferences, or how the narrator is in charge of the characters, all those other kinds of questions. I wondered what you made of this and how this sort of formal experimentation operates in the novel. Do you think it's a postmodernist text? Is that a useful way of thinking about it?
I would think of it as being postmodern light. So I don't think John felt to an extent he understands or understood fiction as a game. But far more important to him was digging for what he would have felt was some kind of truth. Now, getting to a truth is never easy, and usually we never finally get to an absolute truth. But nonetheless, I think John in his writing was always seeking after the truth. And I think to him, the idea of having a final ending was so contrary to what actual truth could be. To impose on Sarah, the character in the novel, one particular ending over another ending is to behave like, I think he uses the phrase somewhere in the novel, an omnipotent God which he is not. And so his awareness to impose one ending over another is actually contrary to the way life works. The parody ending, there's a kind of parody ending of it. And Charles actually settling down with an Ernestina rather than Sarah. And then everybody lives happily ever afterwards. And that's a fairy tale. That's not truth. That kind of ending is not truth. How can he possibly know what Sarah's choices are going to be, what choices Sarah is finally going to make? So I think the refusal to impose one definite ending was that in some way he's respecting the uncertainty of how life turns out.
The parody ending that you mentioned, the first one, where it sort of limps to a close, everyone lives happily ever after. He says, "Oh, let's not bother finding out what happens to some of the characters because who cares? Let's just end it here." Is written in a way to satirize, I suppose, the endings of other novels, I guess. But then there are two later endings that are taken much more seriously, and he inserts himself into the novel, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful chapter, isn't there, near the end? Well, near one of the endings, where you have Charles the hero. Though I feel that word hero is not a great word to use with
The
him.
protagonist, maybe. Yes,
Protagonist, better word. Going up to London, and someone steps into a railway carriage, and John's describing himself as this rather unpleasant gentleman that Charles shares the carriage with. What he's doing is describing a novelist. There's something very inconvenient about novelists because they dig into details about people that can be extremely embarrassing. And it's a wonderful, I feel that chapter is a great portrait of John the novelist.
Yes, he describes the character, the novelist character, I suppose, looking with great menacing intent at the sleeping Charles Smithson.
But that's right. I mean, a novelist can be a bit of a voyeur, in a way. The better novelists tend to be even more voyeurs than the less accomplished novelists. That intensity of gaze can be very unsettling and beyond the bounds of what we would normally accept.
Was it interested in the idea of the omnipotent novelist and omnipotent writer, and how John Fowles perhaps didn't think he was such a creature? He's quite interested in the idea that his characters have their own lives, that they make choices, as you say, that they would articulate themselves in a certain way and not in other ways, and that talks in some of his other writing about how they walk about in the room with him, and how when he goes back to look at his novels again to perhaps work on a screenplay or something, it's like he's bringing them back to life, and he has to spend time with them once again. And also, though, he gives them quite a lot of agency within that, in that they're not pieces just being moved around on a chessboard for him necessarily.
Well, I think that idea of agency, the idea of using a novel to reflect life, which is much, much more complex and uncontainable than the world a novel presents to us, was important to John. And I think the character of Sarah is fascinating as an example of that, because finally John refuses to pin her down, refuses to give some tidy reading of her. And I think that comes out of a respect for the agency of the character. And to a degree, he's suggesting that there's a kind of unknowability that not even he, the novelist who's created this character in the first place, can actually presume to have. He's refusing to be the omnipotent God, I think. And it's a kind of irony, because most novels, I feel, don't display the extraordinary encyclopedic command of a time that John brings to the French lieutenant's women. So in some way, on one level, he does have a degree of omnipotence. As a reader, you feel a bit humbled by this guy who knows so much about so many things. He creates this extraordinary backdrop of such detail, recreated with such fidelity. And so that gives a sense of the omnipotent God. But I think finally, the point of the novel is how absolute knowledge is beyond us. I think one theme which comes through very strongly when he talks about the Victorian age is this is an age that feels that there is certainty, that places great faith in knowledge, but finally, knowledge is beyond even that age. It has so many conceits that prove in the end not actually to hold true.
Well, and Charles himself is a scientist, not a particularly good one, but he's a sort of scientist in the Victorian mould, isn't he? Going around trying to catalogue the world, trying to sort of capture it I got the sense that Charles would never really manage to understand the echinoderms of Lyme Regis particularly well. Let's talk a little bit about that backdrop some more then, because one of the things that Anthony Burgess picks out is the way in which John Fowles refers to other writers and can be compared to other writers of that time. And the novel does this quite deliberately, in that each chapter is meticulously prefaced by a piece of writing from a Victorian text of one kind or another, a bit of poetry or prose or indeed some non-fiction writing. Just wondered how you thought that worked. Is it all about continuing to build this world? I felt there was a bit of game playing going on, because sometimes the texts, the fragments of poetry, don't necessarily relate to what is happening in the chapter that they're attached to, or indeed they kind of contradict them. Wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there's probably a bit of game playing going on. But what you were saying earlier about building a world, my sense is that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to create this Victorian ecosystem. And the epigraphs, I think, work to do that to a degree. But I think also they often work in a way of providing a commentary or setting up a particular theme. So I think they work in different ways, but ultimately there's a sense of him trying to create the substance of the time, bringing a Victorian presence to the novel.
I think that's right. I think a lot of it is texture, absolutely. But, well, I suppose in my reading of it, going back to what we were talking about before, how the novel perhaps leaves you a tiny bit uncertain sometimes about, what is the nature of this text.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the quotes aren't going to be chosen to give one viewpoint. I think there are a range of viewpoints, often contradictory, because that, I think, is what is required to recreate an age, where within that age there are contradictory viewpoints. But it is striking how there are certain voices which he returns to again and again. So within the range of epigraphs that he chooses, I feel you do sense that there's a certain viewpoint that he probably more identifies with than others.
Yes, perhaps so. And thinking about ranges of viewpoints, one of the ways in which that is done is through the cast of characters, some of whom are quite hard to pin down. I think I'm thinking specifically of Sarah Woodruff, who is become a kind of luminous figure, really, and has been read in various different ways since the publication of the novel, as a feminist heroine, as a villain, all these other kinds of interpretations. I suppose this relates to what we were talking about, in that the truth cannot be, or does not want to be, pinned down by John Fowles in this novel. He offers a lot of room for interpretation. I wondered if you had any comments on those aspects of the book.
Well, she's a terrific character, I think. I think Charles is a very limited character. He's a Victorian searching for truth. He wants to become a better person. He's a Victorian progressive, but heavily in quotes. And by the end of the novel, the progress he made in becoming a better person, I think, is very, very limited. Sarah, by contrast, she's trapped by the fact that she lives in this extraordinary, in many ways, quite repressive time. And the way she relates to the world around her is in some striking way, which makes her a wonderful character, free of the prejudices of that time. So I think the fact that she's a marginal character, she's a marginalized character, in some way gives her a basis on which she can also be a free character. And what's wonderful about Sarah is the sense that she finds a way to be free. I think that's one thing that this novel is about. It's about freedom, finding freedom. How can you be free? And to describe as tragic, which some people do, the tragic heroine, I think is to completely misunderstand the novel, because in many ways it seems to me she's the least tragic character, whereas Charles is doomed never quite to escape the grip of the Victorian age. Sarah finds the self-realization which Charles looks for, but finally doesn't really achieve. So I think she is, finally, she is at the heart of this novel. She's what makes it, why one would want to return to it again and again.
Absolutely. That sums it up really well, I think. And the idea of her being a tragic heroine is satirized from the very beginning in a way, isn't it? Ernestina calls her tragedy. as if that's her name, and you.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because I think the Victorians think of her as tragic, because she doesn't have the kind of conventional Victorian niceties that she can cling on to. But by more modern standards, I think we see in her someone who can be free, who's found a way actually to choose her own path. So different ages relate to these characters, I think, in different ways.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that, and that makes me think as well of the two endings that we talked about before, and it would perhaps be easy to think of one of them as being happier, where Sarah makes a choice to be with Charles, and one of them being a bit less happy, where she decides not to. But actually, for Sarah, it is a positive ending, whatever happens.
Oh, hugely. Well, I think the idea, Charles, I mean, he's such a limited character. He feels he's learned to understand the hypocrisy and cant of the Victorian world. But he still wants to impose his world on Sarah at the end of the novel. And Sarah rejects that. She doesn't want to be in prison. And in so many ways, Victorian society was a bit of a prison, especially if you were female. And Sarah throws that back in Charles's face. And I think it's it's a wonderful, liberating ending in some way. I find it a very positive, happier ending than the alternative of her settling into this marriage with difficult to feel wonderful about Charles. Finally, I feel.
Yes, I would agree with that. And yet the idea that the character of Sarah is one of the reasons why the novel is so compelling and people come back to it. I'm sure that is true. I wondered. Well, I wondered if we could talk briefly about the legacy of the novel, and I wondered if you had an opinion of the famous film adaptation.
Yeah, I do. I remember John. Well, he gave the movie a B plus. He thought it was a B plus, which is pretty good compared to previous attempts to adapt his work. I think he was being kind. I think if I was asked to mark that movie, I would give it a straight B. So my problem with it, what I like about it, I think visually, in so many ways, it's stunning. It really captures the world of Lyme. And we haven't talked about Lyme, but I think that's one really hugely important part of the novel. In a way, it's as much a novel about Lyme as it is a novel about the Victorian age. And the film really gets the beauty of the place.
And so we should be clear. This is where John lived, right? Or he lived near there.
Yeah, so he went down to Lyme in the mid-60s, I think. It's about 1965, 66. He bought a house. Well, he bought a house, and that in itself is interesting. He bought a house in a really strange geological area called the Undercliff. So this was where the cliff face would have been eroded next to the sea and created this extraordinary landscape where it was impossible really to have any roads. So it was almost like a kind of little island of land within land. And John's house was in the Undercliff. And at some point he had to leave in the end because the land was prone to subside. And that's what happened to the house. So he lost the house. But I feel that particular place, which John writes about beautifully in the novel, is terribly important to him because there's a symbol of uncertainty and the ephemeral. It has an obvious significance. So the way he uses the themes of the landscape in that particular area is just terribly significant to the novel.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the Undercliff in the novel, it acts as this place where things happen, a place of license, place of danger, place of excitement and romance. It's where the assignations happen between Sarah and Charles, the servants, Sam and Mary. That's where they conduct their courtship, but it's this mysterious and exciting place of inspiration, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly, anything can happen in the Undercliff. It is the place of adventure, for sure. So, the film works, I feel, visually. What I find less satisfying is its effort to construct a parallel to the narrative voice telling the story. And Harold Pinter's way, so the writer of the film was Harold Pinter. And his way of doing that was to create two parallel narratives, a modern narrative and the Victorian narrative. And I just felt that was a little bit simplistic, a little bit contrived, and it didn't really convey what John was trying to do. I just felt it was a little bit heavy-handed, and I don't think it helped that Pinter was bringing a lot of his own baggage. So there's a little bit of a tension, I think, between this fantastic John Fowles novel on the one hand, and on the other, the latest movie by this very well-known screenwriter who had written, very famous movies like The Servant and Accident before. So I just felt there was a kind of hybrid quality, but not in a positive way about the film.
I was interested to read in John Fowles' journals part of his assessment of the film where he said that it was somewhere empty at the heart, which perhaps reflected a fault of the novel itself, which, I mean, I don't know if that is true of the novel, but I thought that was an intriguingly kind of self-reflective view of the film, that his lack of satisfaction with it, he made him think again about the novel, think, oh, maybe I could have articulated that aspects of it in a different way. I just wanted to use that perhaps as a way of thinking about John's attitude to his own work. How did he feel about the novels that he'd written once he'd completed them? Did he, and when he returned to them?
One of the great qualities of the novel, I think, is just not being satisfied with simple truth, not feeling that getting to simple truth is something that can ever be possible. So I think by his very nature, John was going to be discontented. He wasn't ever going to feel that he got something perfect, because perfection isn't something we ever can achieve. So I think it was in his nature to go on to be discontented and to go on striving to find a way of representing the reality, complex realities, as best he could. I think it was being unfair to himself, though, I have to say. I think there is something shallow and a bit empty about the film, but I don't think that was John's fault. I feel that those two parallel narratives, well, I always found myself wanting to get back into the Victorian world because I think that had been more fully realized. And I felt there was something a little bit contrived about the modern world, something a little bit imposed on what actually was the real story. So I just don't think that was John's fault at all. I think it was Pinter not quite getting to the meat of what the novel was about.
Well, let's return to the novel itself to finish. Well, I wonder what you think people think of the novel now, and of John Fowles' writing generally now. Where does it stand?
Yeah, I don't have a great sense of this. I must say, well, he didn't write many novels. He wrote, how many novels did he write? 5, 6? I'm not sure, but not many. And the last novel was a very, very long time ago, Maggot. That's 85, I think. And I feel that since John, since his last novel, well, we've had how many generations? 2 generations of novelists have come along. And I feel, we had our postmodernist phase in the 1980s, and I think that was very much on the tail end of what John had done. And I think he was, at that time, very much held up as being an example of postmodernist literature. But I don't feel that label actually captures what John was about. I don't read huge amounts of contemporary literature, so I don't feel I have the expertise actually to place him in the contemporary landscape. But I do feel he's actually a bit distinct from it. I don't feel that there's an obvious school of John Fowles out there, but that might just be my ignorance.
The writing is still very much in print, and I think that it provides quite a lot of fuel for students in lots of ways. I mean, perhaps the accessibility of it, while at the same time retaining quite a high level of complexity and differences of interpretation, kind of lends itself to those kinds of environments. It was certainly fascinating for me to spend a bit of time with the novel, and I think it's probably going to send me to John Fowles' other work. I wondered if we could finish, though, by adding another novel to Burgess's survey of the 20th century, of which French Lieutenant's Woman is a part. So Burgess picked 99. If you could pick a 100th novel to add to that list, what would it be?
Well, to the extent that the French Lieutenant's Woman is the story of the Victorian age, I find myself thinking of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. There's a shared mission, it seems to me, to capture times and eras and ages. In Orlando's case, you have a character who passes through several ages. In John's case, it's just the one. But it seems to me there's a kind of twin quality between those two novels. So I mentioned Orlando, but also the other striking thing about Burgess's list for me, especially given the fact that to an extent one can talk of The French Lieutenant's Woman as being a feminist novel, is how few women writers there are on the list. So it really needs to have more women writers, and I'm sure he would have sorted out that issue himself had he revisited the list now. So I don't know. I mean, Toni Morrison, beloved. Why is that not on the list? My own another favourite writer of mine is Jean Rhys. The Wide Sargasso Sea, that could be on the list. Although actually I much prefer her earlier 1920s novels. But it just seems to me there's so many women writers who could be on the list and that somehow have been passed over.
Well, I think that's exactly right, and it's great to have your suggestions. Yes, I agree as well. I mean, to be kind to Burgess, I think doing it again now, it would look quite different.
I think it would.
Yes, I suppose we feel that it's a good jumping off point to think about 20th century literature and our literature now, and taking everyone involved in this project some interesting places. Let's finish that there. Charles, it's been really good to talk to you. Thanks so much for taking part.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you again.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Journals, Volumes 1 and 2, by John Fowles and edited by Charles Drazin, are out now from Vintage. Making Hollywood Happen by Charles Drazin is available now. For more information about Anthony Burgess and to support the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the Burgess Foundation's free weekly newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com.